values and all of these things, people respond quite differently to the notion of change. And they behave in the workplace very differently. Some of you may have people working that you're working with that are really kind of threatened by change, and they're all about preserving the status quo. There's not necessarily anything wrong with that, because status quo means tradition, carrying on the history and the legacy of a company. But then you have other leaders who are, let's go. I am always dissatisfied with the status quo and I'm ready to change immediately. And sometimes they're able to do it without much pre-planning. Not saying that that's good either, right? They're just kind of two sides to that coin when we think about change. Others may choose, more incremental change. And then some, and this is why, and we're so glad, if I haven't said it, I'm so glad that you're all here today, because what can happen under high stress, under burnout, which I talk a lot about burnout in my practice, is that leaders can get stuck and unable to cope with the position, or even take a position on the change. They just get stuck. They cannot move in any direction, and that is not what we want for you today. So, or really through this whole 5 weeks, this is about keeping you moving and keeping the momentum going forward. So that's kind of the preface. Believe it or not, my favorite quote about change and about values is Elvis Presley. And he was very famous for, if you look this up, you'll see a thousand quotes attributed to him, that values are like fingerprints. Nobody's are the same, but you leave them all over everything you do as a leader. And I know that many of us have experienced, maybe it was a job earlier in our careers where you're like, gosh, just something is not right. I don't know if it's that I'm not connecting with the culture. Is it the people? It could have been your values. And if it's been a while, a lot of times, if you took an interpersonal communication in college, interpersonal communications class in college, which I used to teach in the 90s, this was an exercise you might have done. But a lot of leaders haven't done this kind of inventory and really looking at their values in a while. So when I'm talking about values, what are values? They are the deepest held beliefs that drive your behavior. And they're really a direct reflection of what's important to you. They also show up every day in the way you interact with others, the way you prioritize things that are on your to-do list, your personal life, your attitude. Everything comes from your core values. They also can help provide focus amidst complete chaos, because they will guide your decision making. And also, even if you don't know, gosh, I'm not sure I'm making the right decision here, at least you know that the decision you made was connected to your values and there was congruency, meaning you can feel good that, you may not have known that this was the right answer, but at least you feel good that you stood in your values. And I'm going to get to a little bit later how your values connect to your company values. So for those of you that maybe have kids, or even your own self, you may think, where do values come from? Well, they come from a lot of different inputs. Yes, the law, but also family, generational history, direct experience, religion, who the leaders and the teachers were in your life, during some pivotal times. The way in which you were educated. There's a lot of ways, right? A lot of things that shape our values. And if you're thinking about, well, gosh, I don't really know where to start, like I'm thinking about my own values, there are some things that you can do here to get to the core values. What did your parents or the caregivers, the people who took care of you when you were a child, what did they value? And what did you learn from that? What were the values that were just taught to you by your family? Sometimes that's, the loudest voice wins in some families. I come from a Polish family, so I know that there's some truth in that. Sometimes it's, that we support one another no matter what. And other times we may have learned some things like how to survive. It depends on your background, good, bad, or otherwise, on what you were taught by your family. And then of course your teachers, which is why I always used to say, my children are now pretty much adults. My youngest is 18, and I used to really value the teachers so much, because I knew that they were really teaching my son values that I wasn't always accessible to him, for him to learn. And then just your culture or your societal values matter a lot. Here is the rub of what I am seeing in my own private coaching practice today, is that people maybe are living values that are not necessarily their core values. And what I mean by that is, you may, let's say you value, uh, you financial freedom, but yet you are living like you spend everything you make and you live paycheck to paycheck. There's an incongruency there, right? If you're not valuing yet you're living a different, like a different way, or if you value, to your core, adventure or thrill seeking, but maybe you have married a spouse that does not have that same value. It doesn't mean you necessarily need to give that up, but what happens is other values kind of come into play. And I just want you to be sure and double check your thinking. Is this a core value to me? Or is this just over the last 10 years, maybe how I have become, or what I have become, or how I am living today? So if you are having a struggle, talk to your spouse or your significant other about, how would you describe my values? Where are you spending your time? What do you spend your money on? Or in general, like, what values do you live by today? We really want to get to, values are like fingerprints. Everyone kind of carries them around differently. What are the values that you wish to live by, that are, or that you live by, that are core to you, and the values that you absolutely must honor to feel like yourself. And the reason why is because it's so important today that you are authentically yourself. We still have to be good leaders, but I think what Elise and I do not want for any of you is to lose sight of who you are in all of this. So in the handout for today, it's something called the values identification. It's in our Dropbox folder. This is just a little clip of it. I have probably 200 different kinds of values. And the assignment is to really take the list from this huge list, and I want you to narrow it down to your top 5 core values. And then there are some other exercises on how you know when you're living those values and when you know that you're not living those values. This is so important right now because this is kind of your mantra, the 5 words, so to speak, that you're going to live by until we get through the other side of COVID and we're into the future of what our, what our new business is, what the new normal is going to be. I also uploaded this, and this is in the Dropbox. I have a lot of clients that look at this and say, okay, so you put your name in the middle, you may put your top 5 values, and maybe this is something that you print out. So I'm preserving the name of this particular client, but I said, can I share this as a thing in this class that I'm doing? And he said, absolutely. And so, if your name was in the middle, this is something that he actually took upon himself to print out, and he hangs it on his wall. And he's making his decisions are guiding him through this time using these top 5 values. And I know that, for some of you that are very senior, this may seem like, oh, I don't want to do this, or this seems kind of junior. You'll be really surprised at the results, particularly after we've gone through some social distancing. Kind of has forced us to maybe be a little introspective, and this is a good time to do this work. This is also in the Dropbox. This is an article, look at this date, from 1999. Peter Drucker was one of the first people. Some of you are smiling, maybe like, I remember this piece. This was like a hot commodity in the late 90s. People were following, we're sharing this around, and Peter Drucker was just a massive thought leader. But he was the first thought leader that connected your values to your company's values and why that mattered. And there's a whole segment in this piece. And again, that this whole article is in the Dropbox for you to take a look at and to read. But we're not in our offices anymore, but for those of you that were, when you were in your office, you may remember, you probably have some values and vision statements on the wall. And hopefully your company did the work to really evaluate and assess, okay, what are our values? How do we connect with our values? I thought this was interesting. This is on Amazon. If you type in values right now, this is actually there. I just found this 2 days ago. These are just literally, this is not customizable. This is a vinyl graphic of a list of values the only thing you can customize is the color, but that you would just hang on the wall and say, yep, these are our values. I don't want you to think about values this way. Please do not go on Amazon and buy a vinyl graphic. If you haven't done the work with your company, this is a great time to, and please email me. I have plenty of exercises to lead your teams through values. I do think a lot of companies may be reinventing some of their values as they come out of COVID as well. But up on the left, I coach at Whirlpool. And I think this is a little bit complicated, but these are like the Whirlpool values. And you may say, well, gosh, I did my core 5 values, Janet, and I don't have any of these as my core 5 values. That's okay. We want you to get close. They don't have to be like a perfect match. We just want them to be, we want your values and your company values to be able to coexist, and that so that you can help make those connections. So that would be like the second part. First, you identify your own core values. I've got a ton of stuff in Dropbox up for you. The second part is then really taking a deeper look at your company values and how you are connected or coexisting. They do not have to be the same with those. So, I always say, yes, people are like snowflakes. No two are the same. But, by knowing yourself, your values, your strengths, even your blind spots, because there are things that you don't know about yourself. Maybe you're learning them now, that you're working from home. Big change often brings on a lot of self-awareness. But truly knowing yourself is going to get us through get you through some really tough times. So I'm going to turn it to Elise, who is going to share her screen to pick up a little bit about our brains.
Okay. Can you see the leader's
Yes.
mindset? You see that beautiful waterfall? Okay, good. Right. I love the values thing, Janet. I remember when I was trying to decide to sell my company, and we took our company's values and lined them up with the buyer who wanted to buy us, and it was true. It wasn't exactly an overlap, but there were so many similarities, and that was just one powerful moment when I realized, wow, it does matter so much that you have alignment in what you do. Work is such a huge part of who we are and where we spend a lot of our life. If you all remember from the landing page, we mentioned something called the leader's mindset. And that's a section of content that Jan and I are really excited about. We're going to include something on the leader's mindset every single session. And our idea behind the leader's mindset is to really help you as a leader to have some tools, tips, techniques, ideas for how to, for yourself as well as for those you lead, managing stress, quieting the inner critic, enhancing your emotional intelligence skills, just achieving a healthy mindset, because right now there's just so much pressure on all of us, but I think it's just particularly difficult for leaders to manage all that they have on their plate. So I have one for you right now, and it's called Your Brain, or How Your Brain Works. So for those of you who know me, know that I like neuroscience quite a bit. I've received my training from the Neuro Leadership Institute, as I mentioned a minute ago, and I became very taken with the idea of how many insights there are about the brain and how much that can really help us as leaders have practical application to our work as daily leaders. So I have a couple of slides to share with you that I hope will be foundational for our conversation over the next 5 weeks about how our brain works and why that matters. And I always like to start with this slide. I know you've seen this visual before of the iceberg. It's a great one. It can be used in lots of ways. But I like to use it to remind us as leaders that we often are tempted to only see people, what we can see above the waterline, what is observable, which is obviously their actions and behaviors and the results that we are driving for as leaders. And so it's tempting to stop just there, but you can't. When you're leading through change, you really have to stretch yourself to understand and see the whole person, not only yourself, to see and lead and manage yourself, but to think about the people that you are leading. Change is particularly difficult for people, and we'll talk about why that is and what we can do to try to mitigate that some. But I think it's just a great reminder for us to say, I've got to look and see the invisible. I've got to seek to understand, as Janet was talking a minute ago, how a person was raised, why they believe what they do, what their values are, what their mindset is, which is what we'll get into in a minute, what they believe and feel. This is really important for us. And let me explain a little bit about how and why. So the brain, you've probably seen a cutaway like this before. The brain is really critical for us as leaders to understand. I've often in my coaching practice, people will say, if I wish I could just understand what's going on inside somebody else's head, which of course I always would say, well, start with what's going on in your own head first. Do you really understand how you're thinking and feeling and why that might be? So we always start by thinking about ourselves, but wow, wouldn't it be great if we could pull back the veil of mystery to understand what is going on inside somebody's head and heart. So here's just a bit of a primer on how your brain works. There are two sort of key parts to your brain: the conscious brain, which is how you think and how you act, and then the unconscious brain, which is characterized by automatic responses and behaviors. Well, there's two stars in each part of these brains, and they're labeled on the left side of your screen. So if you look there, you'll see the prefrontal cortex, which is this part right here. It's right behind your forehead. This is sort of the Goldilocks of the brain, if you will. It's really special and it needs to be taken care of to perform at its best, but it's where you do all the most difficult stuff: strategic planning, complex decision making, really thinking intensively about things. It's also where your personality expression comes to play. And also one of the hardest skills we have as leaders is inhibition, which is all the things you are not supposed to say or do. It all is happening right here in the prefrontal cortex. The other part of the brain to know about is the limbic system. The limbic system is part of the unconscious brain. It's often referred to as the lizard brain. You've probably heard that phrase before, which manages your fight, flight, freeze response, as well as your defense mechanisms. As well as your emotional responses. Any emotion that you're feeling is often managed right out of the limbic system, which again, sort of a clue there is it's an automatic response. So why does this matter? Well, I've got 4 principles to teach you about the brain, and the very first one is around the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex, or I'll refer to it as the PFC. So interestingly, about these 2 parts of the brain, they both are fuel intensive. So if you can recall from your a science class you might have taken in high school or college, what brain fuel is. So besides oxygen and blood, you need water, you need glucose, and probably the most underrated fuel source that you have for your brain to work at its best is sleep, something that is difficult for a lot of us to get right now. You need a lot of these fuel sources in order for your brain to work optimally. And so this is what's interesting about them. Because they're both fuel intensive, when one area of your brain is in control, the other one goes quiet. So for example, when you're triggered by something and you're having a defensive response, or you're having very highly emotional reaction, which part of your brain is in control? It's the limbic system. The limbic system is in control when you're having an emotional response, which means your PFC just goes quiet. And as a result, you don't think very clearly. So that's a really cool thing to understand and really important. You will often hear me say, you need to get your PFC engaged so that you can quiet your limbic system. So second principle to know about is threats and rewards. I love this. I was trying to think of a food slide that's like most commonly loved by everybody. So I thought of the ice cream image, but what's interesting about threats and rewards is much broader than what you're thinking. This is your brain's organizing principle. So from the moment you wake up until the time you go to sleep at night, every day, your brain is constantly scanning the environment to identify a threat or a reward. So for example, if we were in the workplace or even on Zoom, that would still work, but you're looking at someone and you're thinking, is this person a friend or a foe? You look at something to eat. If it's unfamiliar to me, should I try it, or should I opt for my favorite food so that I know that I have a reward involved? So why this matters to you as a leader, just understand this: you move away from threats and you move toward rewards. Away from threats toward rewards. When you are threatened, what's in charge? Your limbic system, right? That takes control to defend yourself. All right, so the threats and rewards principle is really interesting to know also when it comes to things such as conflict management. This helps us understand and explain why people don't like to deal with conflict, because we most generally think of it as a threat, which means we're moving away from it. There's also another big reason why this principle really matters, and it is related to principle number 3, which is social threats and physical threats. So I'll be honest and tell you, when I first heard the neuroscience on this principle, I didn't really believe it. And the idea is that your brain and body respond to social threats in the same way, or sometimes worse than physical threats. So for example, when you might stumble walking down the sidewalk, you can recover from it pretty quickly, right? So there's not as much harm done in a physical threat. But with a social threat, there can be a visceral and sometimes lasting response to a social threat when you experience something like failure or rejection. It might last for years, as example. So why this matters to you as a leader: we are hardwired for living and working in groups, which why this is so difficult for a lot of people to be so separated. We also experience the workplace primarily as a social experience. I thought that was interesting. In the old days, we used to say, well, you come to work, you do your work, and then you go home to your real life. But of course, we know that's not true. This is our real life. They're so integrated these days. Social threats, here's another thing to know as a leader. Social threats can be quite debilitating for you and your team, and they undermine productivity. For example, when you experience a social threat in the workplace, such as somebody's questioning your judgment, how are you going to respond? The part of your brain that's going to take over is your limbic system, because you're defending yourself, right? You feel threatened. You're likely to have a highly emotional response, such as anger in that type of situation. So it really undermines your ability to be productive. And the last principle to know about the brain is something called toward and away. And I like this because remember what I taught you in the second one of threats rewards is we move toward rewards, we move away from threats. Well, toward and away is also a great way for us to think about mindset and how people are approaching situations. If you're in a toward mindset, you have an open mind. You're interested in things, you're curious about things, you're willing to consider new ideas and new potential. When you're in an away state of mind, you feel threatened. You might be triggered by something that has happened to you, like, for example, a loss of autonomy or a loss of status in some way. And as a result, guess what part is in charge? In an away state, your limbic system is in charge. And the reason that's so difficult for us is that when you're in an away state of mind, you are going to miss things, you'll lose focus, you'll become easily distracted. We often jump to conclusions when we're in an away state of mind. We turn inward to defend ourselves. And we usually have a lot of negative assumptions about others' intents, which, as you think about it, you're like, yeah, that happened to me this morning. Or on yesterday's call with somebody else. You can see it happening very practically. And so why this matters, here's the key. You have the ability to influence the state of mind that you are in and that others are in more than you think you do. You can help people shift from an away mindset to a toward mindset. Now you might be asking, like, how do I do that? Well, again, your PFC has to be engaged, right? So there's things you'll do to get their prefrontal cortex engaged. For example, you can ask a question, which makes somebody have to stop and think instead of having an emotional reaction. You can propose ideas that will capture people's attention. Offer somebody an interesting challenge to take on. Engage them in discussion. All of these sort of simple things that we can do as leaders have a way of calming the limbic system and sort of eliminating a lot of the drama that might be going on in a situation and getting people to think. And that's really the key for me, is how do I get my PFC to help me think my way out of this very difficult situation? Because if my limbic system's in charge, I don't really show up very good. I tend to say or do things that I'm going to regret later and spend quite a bit of time trying to recover from. So these 4 principles, and again, these are just foundational. I know it's a bit of a drive-by on neuroscience, but I'm hoping to give you some basic understanding for some of our conversation in our small groups today. Know that this is in a download in the Dropbox, so you can go back and study it just a little bit more. And throughout the 5 sessions, we'll revisit these principles and talk a little bit more about how and why those might matter. But for conversation today around leading through change, I just think this is so huge. Because as Janet said at the very beginning, lots of people like change, are excited about it, and a lot of people do not like it. And they're very much in a threat mode. They're in an away state of mind. So they're not going to be very open to ideas or to see potential benefits that could come from change. And that, of course, makes it really difficult for you as a leader to take them where you want to go. Thinking back to the iceberg slide, though, here's, I think, a really important key. The better you understand what makes someone tick, the more success you're going to have in not only engaging them on a regular basis, but for right now, especially leading them through change. They're going to be more willing to follow where you're going. Another thing I wanted to bring up, and again, this is, we're not going to spend but a minute here and move on. There is a download, and this actually be some homework for you next week. There's a download in the Dropbox, and it's change leadership skills. And Janet and I thought it was important for us to just briefly touch on this, because it's interesting to think as a leader about all of the skills that you have been developing through your career. But when it comes to change, sometimes we find ourselves a little rusty. Like, I'm not exactly sure I have the right skill set I need at this moment in time to lead my team through tremendous change. And so what we've done is we picked 7 skills here that, and a whole self-assessment that we've created for you that's in the Dropbox, to give you kind of a chance to say, you know, hey, where am I right now? What of these skills are strengths for me, and where could I really use some polish and some improvement? And I think it's always good to just stop periodically and do a bit of an assessment to see where you are. So we've created that for you, and that will be one of our assignments for next week. So what we've done is we've gone through a bit about leading self, which is the values discussion that Janet took us through, also understanding a little bit about how our brain works and some of the skills and abilities that we need as leaders. But what about leading everybody else? Like, that's kind of where the rubber meets the road, right? Like, well, I may be good, but how do I get all of these people to follow my lead, or better yet, to help me figure out together where we want to go in this new normal? And I wanted to share this because I know you've seen this before, and we'll put the link to Kotter's website in the Facebook group. But John Kotter is sort of known, you know, for the seminal work on thinking about change management. These are his classic 8-step framework, 8 steps in a framework to help you think about, how am I going to lead through change? And these are fairly timeless. I love this because I went to Harvard for a executive education experience a few years ago when I was leading my company, and I got to hear him speak. He was amazing. We spent one whole day on leading through change, and he spoke for about 2 hours and really brought this framework to life for us. And we'll have some questions in the breakout groups on this framework, but I always like to share it whenever I speak on change, because I just think it's so classic, and it's a good place to start. He has a great book out called Leading Change, which can really kind of give you a sense about, you know, the fundamentals of how and why I want to be able to lead through change, and what are the things that I need to be able to do as a leader to help my team to get there. So if this is sort of classic textbook, what about real life? You know, what about the practical world that we live in? What are some strategies that we can use that kind of build a bit on the brain, but also build on what we know about how to lead through change? I've got a couple that I want to share with you here. This first one, I just call it See It. That's, to me, was one of the simplest ways to share this idea around this particular strategy. And I love this picture of this guy up on the top of this rock. And of course, he looks like he, you know, climbed this rock and has the rope dragging down. Of course, he probably was dropped down there by a helicopter or something for a photo shoot. But in any event, he's at the top of this mountain. And, you know, he's accomplished something big to get to the top of this rock. But where is he looking? Where is he looking? He's looking to the other mountain. How often do you find yourself as a leader doing that, where you've accomplished some sort of big goal? You've reached here. Here was where you were trying to get to, but you only spend just a couple of minutes celebrating that, and then you're off to the next there. And you're always looking to the next goal to accomplish. That's not necessarily a bad thing as a leader, but it can be if it causes us to be overly consumed with getting to there. But in this case, we're thinking about driving and leading for change. We really want to be able to figure out, how do we get other people as excited about change as we might be? Because remember, as a leader, you're almost always further ahead from others than you're further ahead of your team than where you are. So what are some simple ways to do this? You want to put your team and yourself in a toward state of mind, which is engaging which part of the brain? The PFC, right? Thinking their way through things. And you do this really simply. You talk about change. You see people kind of sitting back and being defensive. And you say to them, I just want to think together for a moment as a group. What is it going to be like when we get there? When we accomplish this goal, when we achieve this vision that we have for ourselves, what's it going to be like? and get them to really think out loud. Get them to envision the future very specifically and let them help you paint that picture. And as they get that picture in their mind, it becomes very compelling. And so having that powerful vision in your mind, when you have it, staying where you are is no longer good enough. And I think that's one of the ways that we get our teams a little bit more on board and a little more excited about change than where we are. The next one I want to share with you is on growth mindset. So this is moving from no to not yet. I know you all probably have heard of Carol Dweck. She has a great TED Talk. And Janet, I think, put the link for us there in the Facebook group on that. And this is really great because it allows us as a team to think about when we take on change, it's going to be really tough. But we want to learn to view failure differently and not to be upset when it happens. So we're moving our teams from thinking about, no, we can't do this, to not yet, but we will. Growth mindset is really powerful, but you have to be able to get your team to view failure a little bit differently. Part of the way you do that is you praise effort and you praise strategy. So help run alongside them as they're working to achieve the goal is a really critical part of leading with a growth mindset. And then the last strategy I want to share with you is another part of our leader's mindset, which is shifting your mindset. And this is some cognitive strategies I want to share with you for just a minute or two, and then we're going to our breakout groups where you'll have a chance to discuss this. But cognitive strategies are ways to shift your mind, again, dampening the limbic system so the emotions go quiet, and you're thinking your way through different situations. These strategies are so very useful. The first one, they often is referred to as name it to tame it, which is a skill called labeling, which is you simply saying, I'm feeling frustrated by this situation. The very act of you sort of naming it means you had to think about why you're feeling anxious and saying what you feel. The next one is normalizing. And this one is just great because, and I do this a lot with my coaching clients too, is, hey, it's not just you. Everybody is struggling in this situation. And that has a way of sort of calming your fears and anxieties to realize that it's normal. The third one, reprioritizing. This is really useful on a scale of 1 to 10. How big a deal is this in the whole scheme of your life? Really useful one. The fourth one, the next one is repositioning, which is, I think of this as phone a friend. How might a friend or a mentor advise me in this situation? And the key that why that's so useful is that a lot of times other people can see things more clearly that we can't, or that we have no really good perspective on. And that's why their insight is really useful to us. Distancing is a wonderful cognitive strategy, which is sort of stepping back from the situation in order to be able to see a little more clearly. So a classic line, and Janet and I shared this with our webinar group a few weeks ago, when I look back a year from now, what do I want to be able to say about how I showed up in this moment in time? That's a really simple skill that you can do in any type of situation. Just fast forward, looking back, how do I want to feel about my particular performance? And then the last one here is reframing. It's perhaps the most powerful one, which is what good could come from this? And that's really tough at a time like this. But if you stop and think, there's always something good that can come no matter how tough and challenging things are. So with that, Janet, I think we're ready to go into our breakout.